When I first started shopping around for watches, I had a pretty specific and narrow view of which watches I was interested in. And I kind of had to be, because I really didn't want to spend much money, and the last thing I wanted was to buy a watch that I wasn't going to love. But after collecting watches for about 3 years now, my opinions on a lot of things have kind of really shifted. So today I'm going to show you 5 watches that I absolutely love that I totally would have passed on for what I now think are kind of dumb reasons. Let's get into it. Hey guys, welcome back to Just the Watch. My name's Dave. I live in Japan and I love to collect affordable watches. And if you're thinking about starting a watch collection but you don't have a lot of money, definitely invite you to subscribe to the channel because I think you're going to find a lot of content that will be interesting and helpful for you. And I think the reason a lot of people get into affordable watches is because they can't really afford to spend a lot of money on watches. So you do have to be selective. You do have to kind of figure out your preferences and criteria. And so when I first started collecting watches, I had a very strict criteria of the kinds of watches I would buy when it came to the size or the materials or just the style and preferences. But as this channel has grown, I've had many opportunities to experience watches that were kind of outside of that initial comfort zone, and that experience has really shifted my perception on a lot of these kind of issues. Now this video is probably going to be more helpful for people who are newer into the hobby. People who have been collecting for a while, they tend to solidify their opinions and their preferences. But if you're like I was and you have a lot of questions and you just don't know what's going to be good, hopefully this will be helpful for you. So here are 5 watches or 5 kinds of watches that I was initially kind of avoiding that now I really like. The first one is small watches. That's a very relative term. For me, I considered anything below 40 millimeters to be a small watch. I felt like my sweet spot was right around 42 millimeters for a tool watch and definitely not lower than 40 for a dress watch. When I first started collecting, I did try on some smaller watches and I looked at them on my wrist and I just felt like they looked way too small, kind of ridiculous, like I was wearing a kid's watch or a woman's watch. For reference, I have a 7.5-inch wrist, which is a little bit on the larger side. And particularly when it came to tool watches, I really didn't like dropping below around 42 millimeters. But as I got opportunities to experience smaller watches from time to time, I really started to fall in love with these kind of smaller tool watches in the 38, 39 millimeter range. And a prime example of that is this Zelos Horizons 38 millimeter watch. It also has a compact 43 millimeter lug to lug. And something about a smaller sports watch or tool watch on a metal bracelet I think just looks so perfect and elegant. And smaller watches are comfortable. That's one of the things that really kind of got me sucked into it. Is I was wearing these larger watches, I'd go 42 millimeters, 44 millimeters, sometimes as much as 45 millimeters. And yeah, I liked the way they looked on my wrist, but they were heavy. If I ever had long sleeves, they were kind of always getting in the way. And a smaller watch is just really comfortable, and I've really grown to love the look. Like a big chunky tool watch, is a really fun kind of statement piece to wear, but a more moderately sized watch, now when I look at these watches on my wrist, I feel like it looks like a classic size, maybe a little bit more mature size. I've now got 3 or 4 of these kind of sub 40 millimeter dive style watches that are really some of my favorite watches in my collection. Okay, number 2 would be watches that have maybe older movements that don't feature hacking or hand winding. There's actually still a fair number of watches like this out there. If you go to the older Seiko 5 line, those all have Seiko 7S26 movement, which does not feature hacking or hand winding. There's a lot of low-cost watches that feature Miyota 8000 series movements that don't have hacking. However, much of those have been updated recently to include that feature. But early on, I got a Seiko 5 watch, and it just really annoyed me having to kind of shake the thing to get it started in the morning and not be able to stop the second hand when I pulled the crown out and hack it. Just made it feel like a cheap watch compared to my watches that had like an NH35 movement. But there was one watch that played a big role in kind of getting me over that, and that is this Laco Casablanca. So this one features a slightly older Miyota 821A movement, which the new ones do have hacking. But this one, when I purchased it, it had the older movement inside of it, which does not have hacking. So when you pull the crown out on this one, the second hand just continues to sweep. And this is a fairly expensive watch, and I do think that that was one of the biggest drawbacks about this watch was the older movement inside of it. I loved everything else about this watch except for the movement. And for a long time, I almost wound up selling this watch because of the movement and just because yeah, I felt like this should have a better movement inside of it for the price that I paid and the price that Laco was asking. But as time went on, I came to really appreciate more and more the other aspects of this watch, the build quality, the finishing, the dial work, just the overall quality of basically everything else about the watch. And that lack of hacking in this movement came to bother me less and less. And while I almost sold this watch a number of times, I held on to it, and it's now one of my favorite watches. It's one I don't plan on getting rid of. It's kind of become a cornerstone of my collection, and it's lasted longer than most other pieces that I have. Particularly when you're looking at affordable watches, if you don't exclude watches that lack hacking or hand winding, it really opens up a lot of cool possibilities. And now I kind of feel like those features, well, they're very convenient and nice. They're not really essential, and it's not too big of a deal if they're not on a watch. I more look at the other aspects of a watch now. Seiko's 7S26 movement and Miyota's 8000 series movements, while they're lacking hacking or hand winding, or both in some cases, they have a great reputation for durability and longevity and a decent amount of accuracy for the price that they're found for. So now, rather than immediately writing off watches that have those movements inside, I look at the other aspects of the watch, and often I can find some pretty cool watches that I've really fallen in love with. Okay, before we move on to the third one, let me tell you a little bit about my t-shirt store. I am selling t-shirts like this one right here, so you can get this in my t-shirt shop. I've been working to try and put together a lot of cool designs that would be interesting to people who are into watches. So I'll leave a link to that down below. Do me a favor and check it out. Support the channel, and thanks for watching. Okay, so let's move on to the third watch that I almost wrote off. And that would be watches with rubber straps. I used to associate rubber strapped watches with just being cheap. The rubber strap was my least favorite kind of watch strap, and I avoided watches that came on rubber straps at all costs unless I was planning to immediately swap the strap out. And that was kind of what my plan was when I got my Seiko Samurai, but in a weird roundabout way, that was the watch that kind of really turned me on to rubber straps. So you can get the Seiko Samurai on a bracelet, but it's cheaper if you buy it on the silicone strap. And so that's what I did. I got on the silicone strap with the intention of immediately swapping over to a Beads of Rice bracelet from Uncle Seiko. But I also decided to try out some of Uncle Seiko's kind of premium rubber straps and had them send some of those over. And I wound up really liking the watch more on those premium rubber straps than I did on the bracelet. It looks great on the bracelet, but there is something to be said about a good high quality rubber strap. I'm not a big fan of silicone straps, but a good natural rubber or vulcanized rubber or these new FMK rubber straps, those just have such a great feel to them. They have a great look. I really like the look of rubber waffle straps. I think they give a great vintage vibe to a lot of classic divers. And I think they suit the personality of a lot of dive watches more than a metal bracelet does. Metal bracelet for me is kind of like a way to dress up a dive watch. It is very functional. You can certainly wear it in the water, but a lot of metal bracelets that come out now, they're more kind of for decoration, whereas I feel like a rubber strap is more of like a tool strap. So both thematically and visually, I think they look great. And if you get a nice rubber strap, they really feel great on the wrist as well. The fourth kind of watch I used to write off are automatic watches with closed casebacks. When I first started getting into collecting watches with automatic movements were like the coolest things in the world. And I still think they are. My collection has always featured a combination of both quartz and automatic watches, but especially when I was getting started, getting an automatic watch was a very special thing. I had mostly quartz watches because they were more affordable. And so if I was going to get an automatic watch, I really wanted to see the automatic movement inside of it. And I definitely still think that for people who are newer into the hobby, getting a watch where you can see the movement is a big deal. That should be something that you should prioritize. But while my love for automatic watches hasn't faded at all, my kind of need to actually be able to see the movement has mostly gone away. In fact, I think a closed caseback watch does have some benefits over an open caseback watch. Oftentimes it allows the watch to be a little bit thinner. Often it's a little bit more solid and protected because you don't have glass on the back, but a nice solid piece of metal. And when you're in the affordable watch realm, most of the movements you see are Seiko NH35s or Miyota movements, and you start to get used to what they look like. The novelty of seeing that Seiko NH35 movement does tend to wear off. So a lot of times having a closed caseback with a unique design on it can be an opportunity to add some cool touch and flavor to a watch. And so when I picked up this Yema Navigraph GMT, I didn't bat an eye at all knowing that this watch had a closed caseback on it, even though it does have a unique movement inside of it. This has the Yema 3000 in-house automatic GMT movement, which I would like to see. But despite this watch having a closed caseback, I absolutely love everything else about it. It's my newest watch. It's currently my favorite watch. And yeah, earlier me might have passed on this because it doesn't have that open caseback behind it where I could see the movement. Finally, number 5 is watches with acrylic crystals. I used to associate acrylic crystals with the cheapest of the cheap watches, like basically plastic watches with plastic crystals. And I especially didn't want to get an acrylic crystal on a dress watch. I have a strong preference for dress watches that aren't looking all scuffed up. I feel like if I'm going to get dressed up and wear something kind of fancy, I want a watch that matches that, and a watch with a scuffed up crystal I thought just wouldn't go well. But I've really come around to acrylic crystals, and there's a number of watches that I really hesitated on for a long time because they had acrylic crystals. But I now think that acrylic crystals have a lot going for them. Prime example is this dress watch from Vostok, of all places. And Vostok puts acrylic crystals on a lot of their watches. Their Amphibia line that's incredibly popular, the Komandirsky line, those all have acrylic crystals. And yeah, they're going to get scuffed up. But here's the thing, with acrylic crystals you can spend a little bit of money and buy some poly watch, and while you can't completely remove the scratches, you can make them much less noticeable. And particularly on watches with a vintage styling like this dress watch from Vostok, I think those small scratches can add a little bit of character, and it doesn't really bother me as much. Also, this watch is an incredible watch for the price. I think it's about $60, it has a hand-wound movement inside of it, and it is incredibly thin. I looked around for a long time for a hand-wound dress watch that was this thin, couldn't find it anywhere. I was putting my budget up to, $300-400, trying to find something in that price range. And then when I came across this one for $60, I figured I'd give it a shot, and I was just blown away with how cool it looks. Now this is a cheap watch, and the acrylic crystal is probably part of a cost-saving measure on that end, but I still love the way it looks. And I'm starting to see a lot of benefits to acrylic crystals. People often describe them as having kind of a warmer feel than sapphire, both to the touch and to the look. They also tend to have less reflections than sapphire crystals do. So while scratches will reduce your visibility, at least you don't have to also deal with reflections. Finally, acrylic crystals are more shatter resistant than both mineral and sapphire crystals, which is why NASA went with the Hesalite version of the Omega Speedmaster for their moon missions, which is basically an acrylic crystal, because they were worried that if a crystal shattered in the space capsule, there'd be these shards of sapphire or glass floating around the cockpit, and that would have been very dangerous. Whereas an acrylic crystal tends to just kind of crack if it gets banged around too hard. So while acrylic crystals are the easiest kinds of crystals to scratch among the ones that are currently in use, they're also probably the toughest. So particularly on tool watches and watches with vintage stylings, I would totally go for a watch with an acrylic crystal. I think sapphire is still usually my preference, but acrylic is a close second in some circumstances. Now, I'm sure everybody watching this has some opinions on these issues, so hit me up in the comments, let me know what you think. Let me know which watches you wrote off when you were initially into collecting and now have kind of fallen in love with and changed your mind on. Love to hear about that. And let me know if there's any of these 5 that I listed that you are still really hard set against. Love to kind of continue this discussion in the comments down below. Again, make sure you check out the t-shirt shop, leave a link to that as well. But that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.